The sun had barely breached the horizon over the Missouri Ozarks, yet Lenora Whitlock was already moving through the mist that clung to the rolling hills like a damp shroud. The morning air was thick and heavy, the kind of oppressive humidity that made every breath feel like a deliberate effort. She paused at the edge of the clearing in front of the Whitlock homestead, eyes scanning the underbrush with attention that had become almost second nature. The events of the previous nights had left her sleep-deprived, haunted by a fear that burrowed deep into her bones. It had begun subtly, strange noises outside the cabin, footsteps in the undergrowth, whispers that carried across the empty fields at night, had gone unnoticed by the casual observer, dismissed as the wandering of deer or the wind through the oak canopies. But Lenora, whose family had lived in Cedar Glen for generations, had learned to recognize the difference between ordinary sounds and the sinister intrusions that heralded calamity. It was not until her eldest son, Eli, failed to return from his loft bed one July morning, leaving only his frightened younger brother Jonas cowering behind the storage chest, that the true scope of the danger became unmistakable. The boy's small frame trembled uncontrollably as he whispered fractured recollections of shadowed figures moving through the night. They came for him, bad men, dragging, shouting. His voice was broken, punctuated by sobs that racked his body like gusts of violent wind. Lenora clutched Jonas to her chest, feeling the rapid thrum of his heart, each beat a frantic echo of her own growing panic. She had always known that the Whitlocks' history contained secrets better left undisturbed, records and journals accumulated over decades, chronicling births, deaths, marriages and property transfer. But she had never considered that those very records could paint a target on her children's backs. The search for Eli consumed the morning. Every able-bodied man in Cedar Glen combed the hills and ravines surrounding the settlement, shouting his name into the dense mist. Lenora joined the parties with a desperation that bordered on hysteria, her voice hoarse from calling and recounting every possible hiding spot. Yet she noticed, with a prickling unease, how some neighbors seemed to move with uncanny certainty, as if they already knew the boy's whereabouts. It was an old logging pit, long abandoned and partially obscured by brush, where Eli was eventually found. Joseph Calvert, a local farmer with a reputation for meticulous observation, led the group that stumbled upon him. The boy was unconscious, bruised and broken, his small leg twisted unnaturally and blood matted across his hairline from a laceration that would leave a lasting scar. Like his late cousin Tobias, Eli had no memory of how he ended up there, recalling only the journey from bed to darkness and the pain that had made the hours feel like an eternity. The evidence left little room for doubt. His nightshirt was torn, fabric shredded in ways suggesting he had been dragged rather than walking under his own power. Cuts and abrasions lined his bare feet, and rope burns encircled his wrists, indicating he had been bound. Most damning of all was the discovery of a worn leather boot at the edge of the pit, similar to the type used by foremen and hunters in the region. Witnesses insisted that Calvert had been wearing both boots just days before, and yet one had inexplicably appeared at the site. The collection of evidence painted an unmistakable picture. Eli had been kidnapped, tortured, and abandoned to die. Rather than rallying to Lenora's cause, Cedar Glen's residents recoiled, their faces a mixture of fear and carefully concealed indifference. The message was clear: to draw attention to the Whitlocks' suffering was to risk the wrath of the founding families who controlled every aspect of the community's life. Generations of intimidation, bribery, and mutual complicity had woven a web in which neighbors were both enforcers and bystanders. The realization hit Lenora with a grim clarity. If the law and her neighbors would not protect her children, she alone would have to wield justice. Her first target was Joseph Calvert, the man whose boot had been found at Eli's near-death scene. For weeks she observed his routines, noting the solitary trips he made to tend livestock in the hills, paths far removed from the eyes of the settlement. One humid night in late July, when the cicadas droned in unison and shadows thickened under the oak canopy, Lenora positioned herself along the trail, Samuel Whitlock's old rifle clutched tightly in her hands. Dark clothing made her nearly invisible, blending seamlessly with the night. When Calvert emerged on the familiar path, he did not sense the danger until it was too late. Lenora's voice cut through the silence. "You harmed my son," she said, her words steady, each syllable a hammer blow to the truth he had long tried to hide. His smile in response was chilling, a confirmation of the knowledge he held and the crimes he had committed. In one swift motion, the rifle discharged and Calvert fell, life draining from him into the thirsty earth. The act was only the beginning. Lenora understood that removing him did not end the threat. It merely marked the first move in a game that had been decades in the making. News of his death rippled through the settlement, eliciting outward expressions of shock. But beneath the surface, fear and suspicion festered. Mabel Crane, an elderly woman known for her root cellar preserves and meticulous household management, was the next in Lenora's calculated plan. Crane's root cellar, deep and reinforced with stone, was accessed through a heavy wooden hatch prone to sticking. Lenora had observed the older woman for weeks, noting the precise moments when she would descend into the cool darkness to retrieve her preserves. On a moonless night, Lenora weakened the latch just enough to ensure a catastrophic failure. 3 days later, Crane's descent ended in disaster. The hatch gave way, sending her plummeting into the stone-lined chamber. The lantern she carried shattered, flames licking at the wood as her neck struck the floor with a sickening crack. Her death was deemed a tragic accident, exactly as Lenora had intended. But her most formidable adversary remained Reverend Silas Pritchard. As Cedar Glen's spiritual leader, his authority was absolute, and direct action against him risked not only her life but the complete annihilation of her children. The confrontation, when it came, was a carefully orchestrated duel of words and revelation. Pritchard arrived at the Whitlock cabin, his presence both commanding and threatening. Jonas clung to Lenora, sensing the danger with a child's intuitive terror, while Eli, despite his youth, displayed a steady, protective composure. For nearly 2 hours, the minister revealed the history of Cedar Glen's founding families, a litany of crimes hidden beneath the veneer of piety and respectability. Fraud, bigamy, and murder were the tools used to build new lives on the ruins of others. The Whitlock's ancestors, Pritchard explained, had kept records that threatened to expose the conspiracy, records that Samuel Whitlock had inherited. His death from apparent illness had been deliberate, designed to look natural while silencing the threat. Now her children were targets, their bloodlines deemed too dangerous to survive into adulthood. "You have until tomorrow evening to decide," Pritchard said, his voice calm and final. "Bring the boys and their deaths will be swift. Refuse, and the entire settlement will be convinced you are a witch complicit with dark forces." The minister, however, had revealed a crucial vulnerability: the location of the incriminating papers, hidden beneath the meeting house altar. As soon as he left, Lenora prepared. She gathered rope, oil, flint, and a small knife, everything necessary for the confrontation that would decide not only her children's fates, but the survival of the truth. Sunset arrived, painting the Ozarks in hues of blood and gold. Lenora led her children toward the meeting house with calm, deliberate steps, carrying the weight of inevitability and vengeance. The building loomed before her, an unassuming wooden structure, masking a decade of corruption. Shadows flickered behind the windows, Pritchard and his allies unaware that the night would not go as planned. Lenora entered through the rear, moving with practiced stealth to the secret compartment beneath the altar. Inside, decades of hidden documents waited: forged marriage certificates, property deeds, baptismal records, and detailed accounts of murders disguised as accident. Among them were more recent papers, extending the conspiracy beyond Cedar Glen, implicating accomplices across the Missouri Territory. Footsteps approached. Pritchard and 2 men entered the main room. "Mrs. Whitlock," he called, confident, "I trust you've brought the boy." Lenora struck a flame to the oil, igniting the wooden floor. Flames spread instantly, consuming the building with a ferocity matched only by her resolve. "These papers contain the truth," she called above the roar. "Every crime, every murder, every lie. You cannot hide behind death or fear any longer." The fire forced the men back, their faces lit by terror and anger. Lenora remained, clutching the documents to her chest, ensuring that while the evidence perished, so too did the power to continue the cycle of fear. By morning, the meeting house was reduced to charred ruins, and the seeds of justice had begun to sprout. The morning after the fire dawned over Cedar Glen in a haze of smoke and ash. The ruins of the meeting house stood like a blackened skeleton against the early light, its skeletal beams reaching skyward as if imploring the heavens for judgment. Word of the blaze spread quickly through the settlement, carried by the whispers of curious neighbors and frightened children. By mid-morning, the story had reached every cabin. Lenora Whitlock had set fire to the meeting house. Some gasped in horror, others nodded in grim approval, and a few, emboldened by the display of courage, began to speak of the injustices they had suffered at the hands of the founding family. Reverend Pritchard and his two companions had survived the fire, but the cost was immense. In the chaos of fleeing the flames, they had abandoned their carefully hoarded documents, the same evidence that had maintained their dominion over Cedar Glen for over a decade. Without it, their threats carried no weight. The blackmail, the manipulations, and the orchestrated deaths could no longer be tied directly to the perpetrator. In the broader context of the Missouri Ozarks, the tale of Lenora Whitlock became a subject of whispered conversation, a legend that straddled the line between history and folklore. Parents warned their children of the dangers that lurked behind polite facades, of the capacity for cruelty disguised as piety, and of the importance of vigilance in a world where power was often maintained through secrecy and fear. Scholars and chroniclers who later examined territorial records would encounter gaps, inconsistencies, and tantalizing fragments of documents that spoke to a hidden history, one in which corruption, conspiracy, and courage intertwined in the rugged landscape of America's frontier. Lenora herself never sought recent beyond the survival of her family. She lived quietly, teaching her children the lessons of the past, while shielding them from the worst horrors of human ambition. Yet her presence remained a silent warning to Cedar Glen. Even in communities built upon deception and intimidation, truth could not be entirely extinguished. When confronted with evidence of injustice, the consequences could be swift, severe, and irreversible. By the time Eli and Jonas reached adulthood, Cedar Glen had transformed. The settlement, once dominated by fear and secrecy, had begun to embrace a new era, one tempered by accountability and tempered oversight. The legacy of Lenora Whitlock, her defiance, her courage, and her unwavering commitment to protecting her children, served as a moral compass for the community, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, acts of bravery and integrity could alter the course of history. In the quiet evenings, as the sun set over the rolling hills, Lenora would often sit on the porch of the Whitlock homestead, watching her sons work in the fields or tending livestock. The air was no longer heavy with dread but carried the scent of fresh earth, growing crops, and the faint tang of lingering smoke, a reminder of both past horrors and hard-won freedom. She understood, better than anyone, that survival was not merely the preservation of life, but the preservation of truth, and that her children, armed with knowledge and courage, represented a future in which the darkness that had once consumed Cedar Glen could never dominate again. Even as whispers of the Whitlocks' heroism spread throughout the Ozarks, Lenora remained humble, aware that the line between vengeance and justice was perilously thin. She had acted decisively to protect her family, and in doing so had altered the course of her community's history. The sacrifices she had made, the dangers she had confronted, and the lives she had saved formed a narrative that would endure far beyond her own lifetime, a testament to the power of a mother's courage and the enduring resilience of the human spirit. The years following the fire at Cedar Glen brought a slow, uneasy peace to the Whitlock family. The meeting house's charred remains remained a stark reminder of the horrors that had shaped Lenora's life, and yet amid the ashes, a new order had begun to take root. Many of the once powerful families who had ruled the settlement through fear had fled, their influence shattered. Others, those who had remained, faced public scrutiny and legal action. The Ozarks, once a region cloaked in secrecy and terror, was beginning to understand the cost of unchecked power. Lenora's sons, Eli and Jonas, grew under her careful guidance, aware of both the beauty and the brutality of the world they inhabited. She taught them the skills required to survive on the frontier, tracking, hunting, and the meticulous care of livestock and crops. But more importantly, she instilled in them the necessity of discernment, the ability to read human behavior, and the courage to act decisively when injustice arose. The shadow of Cedar Glen's past hung over their education like a silent instructor, one whose lessons were as urgent as they were unforgiving. By 1838, the Whitlocks had become a quiet yet respected presence in the community. Their neighbors, once cowed by the influence of the founding families, began to treat them with a mix of wariness and admiration. Lenora had rebuilt their home with her own hands, ensuring that it was both defensible and welcoming, a sanctuary from the lingering threats that stalked the Ozarks. She remained vigilant, knowing that even diminished, the families who had once ruled Cedar Glen were unlikely to accept their loss of power without attempts at retribution. Despite the Whitlocks' vigilance, The specter of past crimes continued to ripple through the region. Occasionally, remnants of the old guard would attempt intimidation, veiled threats left at the doorstep, livestock mysteriously disappearing, or minor fires that tested the family's defenses. Lenora faced these provocations with the same steely resolve she had shown in her reputation as a woman willing to confront injustice, combined with the tangible evidence she had preserved in meticulous records, dissuaded most from escalating their threats. As Eli entered his teenage years, he began showing signs of intellectual curiosity reminiscent of his father Samuel. He spent hours poring over maps, accounting ledgers and historical documents that Lenora had salvaged from the meeting house fire. Jonas, quieter but no less intelligent, showed a talent for observation, noticing the small details others overlooked, and learning to anticipate potential danger. Lenora encouraged their studies, understanding that knowledge would be their greatest protection in a world where brute force alone could never guarantee safety. In 1841, news arrived that sent ripples of unease through the Whitlock's carefully maintained peace. One of Cedar Glen's former ministers, long thought exiled to another territory, had returned to Missouri. Reverend Pritchard, weakened but not broken by his losses, began quietly gathering allies, seeking to reclaim the influence he had once wielded over the settlement. Letters carried in secrecy hinted at plans to discredit Lenora and her family, accusing them of falsehoods, witchcraft, and fraud. The past, it seemed, was not done with the Whitlocks. Lenora responded with calculated precision. She summoned her sons and explained the history they had inherited, not as a tale of terror, but as a lesson in strategy and resilience. She taught them to anticipate threats, to recognize deception, and to wield the tools of influence without succumbing to corruption. The Whitlocks became proactive, documenting every interaction, gathering corroborating testimonies from neighbors who had endured the tyranny of Cedar Glen's founding family. By turning the community into allies, Lenora ensured that any attack on their reputation would be met with scrutiny and skepticism rather than fear. The turning point came in the summer of Pritchard and his followers, emboldened by years of quiet planning, attempted to stage a public accusation against Lenora and her sons during a gathering at the new meeting hall. The hall, smaller and less imposing than the original, was packed with settlers eager for news of the community's ongoing disputes. Pritchard, confident and theatrical, began to enumerate supposed misdeeds of the Whitlocks, intending to provoke public outrage, but Lenora was she presented evidence of the past crimes committed by Cedar Glen's founding families, the falsified documents, property transfers, and eyewitness accounts that Pritchard and his cohorts had long relied upon to maintain their dominance. The assembled settlers, many of whom had suffered under the old regime, reacted not with fear but with outrage. Pritchard's carefully orchestrated narrative collapsed under the weight of truth. Humiliated, he and his followers were forced to flee once more, their reputation irreparably damaged. The events of that summer solidified the Whitlocks' place in Cedar Glen. Lenora's courage, intelligence, and unwavering commitment to truth transformed the settlement. Fear no longer dictated the community's actions. Accountability and transparency began to take hold, shaping a new social order. Eli and Jonas, now fully aware of their mother's sacrifices and the history of the region, embraced their roles as guardians of both family and community. They understood that the lessons of the past were not merely cautionary tales, but blueprints for ensuring that corruption could never again take root unchecked. Lenora lived out the remainder of her life quietly but with a profound sense of purpose. She witnessed the transformation of Cedar Glen from a town haunted by secrecy and terror into a community tempered by justice and vigilance. Her sons, educated in both the practical and moral lessons of survival, carried forward her legacy, ensuring that the horrors she had endured and the courage she had shown would not be forgotten. By the time of her death in 1845, Lenora Whitlock was remembered not as a mad woman or a criminal, but as a mother and protector, a figure who had confronted overwhelming odds to preserve her children and expose a network of injustice that had plagued the Missouri Ozarks for over a decade. Her story, preserved through oral tradition, surviving documents, and the unwavering testimony of her sons, became a cornerstone of the region's history, a tale of resilience, courage, and the enduring power of truth in the face of corruption. Even now, more than a decade later, travelers through the Ozarks whisper of the Whitlock homestead and the woman who had stood against tyranny. The meeting house ruins, long since rebuilt, bear subtle marks commemorating her defiance. Cedar Glen, transformed by her actions, stands as a testament to the idea that even in the darkest corners of human ambition, one individual's courage can reshape an entire community. Lenora's legacy endures, not as legend alone but as living proof that justice, once pursued with unwavering resolve, can outlast fear, oppression, and even the passage of time itself. Even after Lenora Whitlock's passing in 1845, the ripples of her courage continued to shape Cedar Glen. Though her body rested in the modest family plot atop the ridge, her presence remained in the hearts of her sons and the collective memory of the town. Eli and Jonas, now young men, had inherited more than just her homestead. They carried the mantle of vigilance, guardianship, and moral fortitude that had defined her life. The region was changing. Missouri's Ozarks, once a frontier of lawlessness and isolation, had begun to experience the slow encroachment of territorial officials, surveyors and circuit courts. Settlers, who had once depended on fear and secrecy to maintain control, were increasingly vulnerable to investigation. Among these were remnants of the families who had orchestrated Cedar Glen's dark history. Many tried to rebuild influence quietly, but the Whitlocks' steadfast resistance and the scattered evidence Lenora had preserved ensured that no secret could remain buried for long. In 1847, a series of territorial audits brought the long-concealed criminal networks into the light. Land deeds, tax records, and surviving documents from the old meeting house, including a portion of Lenora's meticulously kept copies, revealed patterns of fraud, exploitation, and violent suppression of potential witnesses. The Whitlocks, having anticipated the importance of documentation, cooperated with officials cautiously, their evidence instrumental in dismantling decades of corruption. Settlers, who had benefited from the old regime, faced criminal charges, fines, and public disgrace. Despite the justice meted out by territorial authorities, the Whitlocks' victory came with lingering tension. Families displaced or ruined by Lenora's revelations harbored resentment, and whispers of vengeance floated through Cedar Glen. Eli and Jonas, trained by years of observation under their mother's guidance, recognized these threats and managed them with care, balancing assertiveness with diplomacy. They had learned through hard experience that survival demanded both courage and subtlety, and that the mistakes of the past could never be ignored. The legacy of Cedar Glen's dark history became entwined with the Whitlocks' own narrative. Eli, the elder of the two, took a particular interest in chronicling the events that had shaped their family. He meticulously documented the story of the meeting house fire, the exposure of the founding family's crimes, and Lenora's sacrifice. These records were safeguarded alongside the surviving papers that had once been hidden beneath the altar, a careful, deliberate effort to ensure the truth endured. Jonas, meanwhile, became a master of practical survival, honing skills in hunting, tracking, and fortification, ensuring that the family homestead could withstand both human and natural threats. Together, the brothers combined intellect and action, honoring their mother's example in every decision they made. As the decade drew to a close, Cedar Glen slowly transformed. Fear, once a tool wielded by a few to control many, gave way to cautious trust among neighbors. The settlers who remained, whether through conviction, necessity, or sheer resilience, began to embrace a community structured around transparency, accountability, and mutual protection. Eli and Jonas's leadership, though quiet and deliberate, helped stabilize the settlement, bridging the gap between frontier survival and the emerging rule of law. Yet the past was never far from the Whitlocks' thought. On moonlit nights, the memory of the meeting house fire haunted the ridge, the crackling flames, and the acrid scent of burning timber, lingering like an echo. Lenora's courage remained a touchstone, a reminder that the price of justice could be steep, and that the shadow of wrongdoing could reach across decades if left unchecked. The Whitlocks, conscious of this history, used it as both a warning and a guide, instilling in the next generation the understanding that vigilance was not merely a choice, but a responsibility. In 1850, Eli, now a man of 22, stood atop the ridge overlooking Cedar Glen. The valley below, once a place of fear and secrecy, now bore the signs of growth and community. Fields flourished, homes were repaired, and the town, scarred but resilient, had begun to thrive. Eli's gaze lingered on the remnants of the old meeting house, its ruins a solemn monument to both cruelty and courage. He thought of his mother, her sacrifices, her unwavering resolve, and the lessons she had imparted. He knew the truth. Cedar Glen would never forget Lenora Whitlock. Her story was embedded in the town's foundation, in its recovered records, and in the conscience of every resident who had witnessed her defiance. More than that,
Her life had become a blueprint for resilience, teaching future generations that courage, intellect, and moral clarity could alter the course of a community. Even in the darkest of circumstance, Jonas joined him at the ridge, carrying the tools of a frontier life and the quiet strength that had always defined him. Together, they surveyed the land their mother had protected with her life. Though shadows of the past lingered, the Whitlocks had turned tragedy into purpose, grief into vigilance, and fear into empowerment. Cedar Glen, scarred but unbroken, stood as a testament to Lenora's legacy, a reminder that even in a world dominated by secrecy, corruption, and violence, one determined individual could wield truth and courage as weapons to protect the innocent and challenge the powerful.
In the years that followed, stories of Lenora Whitlock became part of Missouri's frontier folklore. Travelers spoke of the woman who had faced the darkest forces in Cedar Glen and emerged victorious, not through brute strength alone, but through cunning preparation and an unbreakable bond to her children. Scholars and historians who later examined the settlement's records uncovered the intricate web of crimes and conspiracies that Lenora had exposed. Her story remained both cautionary and inspirational, a reminder of the fragile balance between justice and vengeance, and of the enduring power of one person's resolve to shape the destiny of many. Even now, long after her death, the ridge overlooking Cedar Glen bears her name. Visitors report an eerie presence, a fleeting shadow of a woman standing watch over the valley below. Some claim to hear the faint whisper of instructions or warnings in the wind, as if Lenora Whitlock's spirit remains vigilant, guarding her legacy and ensuring that the lessons of the past are never forgotten. The haunting of Lenora Whitlock is, at its core, not just a story of tragedy or vengeance, but a chronicle of courage in the face of unimaginable adversity. It reminds us that the frontiers of early America were not merely wild landscapes, but arenas where human ambition, cruelty, and heroism collided. Lenora's life and sacrifice echo through the annals of Missouri's history, a timeless testament to the power of a single person's will to confront evil, protect the innocent, and leave a lasting mark on the world, even in the shadow of death. The years following Lenora Whitlock's death were a time of both rebuilding and reckoning in Cedar Glen. The town had survived the upheaval left in the wake of her final confrontation, but scars remained both physical and emotional. The ruins of the old meeting house stood as a blackened reminder of corruption's destruction, and the stories of Lenora's courage spread like wildfire among settlers who remembered fear as well as hope. Eli and Jonas Whitlock, now men in their mid-20s, had become quiet leaders in the community. Their mother's lessons in observation, caution, and resolve had shaped them into individuals who understood the fragility of safety in a world ruled by human greed and malice. Eli took responsibility for maintaining the family records, ensuring that the evidence Lenora had preserved and what had survived the fire was catalogued, protected, and ready for future scrutiny. Jonas, meanwhile, became the practical guardian of the homestead, a sentinel who could defend the land and the family against threats both natural and human. Cedar Glen slowly transformed under their watch. Families who had been cowed into silence by fear began to speak, and some descendants of the old regime faced public scrutiny or fled to avoid the consequences of their ancestors' deeds. The Whitlocks' intervention had shifted the balance of power in the town, replacing secrecy and intimidation with accountability and cautious cooperation. Yet, for all the progress, the shadow of the past lingered. Whispers of Lenora's deeds, both admired and feared, persisted in the taverns and homes of Cedar Glen, mingling with the sighs of the Ozark wind through the trees. By 1853, a historian from St. Louis arrived in Cedar Glen, eager to document the frontier's darker history. He found Eli Whitlock willing to recount the events surrounding the old meeting house, carefully describing his mother's actions, the conspiracies she had uncovered, and the devastating fire that had sealed her fate. Eli spoke with a measured tone, aware that some listeners would consider Lenora a hero while others might brand her reckless. Nevertheless, the historian's records preserved the Whitlocks' testimony, adding a permanent dimension to the story that Lenora had sacrificed her life to protect. As time passed, the Whitlocks discovered other remnants of the conspiracy, hidden in attics, barns, and even buried beneath old hearths. Letters, deeds, and personal journals from the founding families emerged, many containing incriminating evidence that confirmed what Lenora had known in her final days. The reach of corruption had extended far beyond Cedar Glen, touching neighboring settlements and even officials in distant territory. With each discovery, Eli and Jonas realized that their mother's foresight had been remarkable. Her efforts to preserve the truth had ensured that justice, though delayed, remained possible. Yet the personal cost of her actions reverberated through the family. Both brothers carried the weight of her sacrifice, a reminder that courage often comes at a price too high for many to bear. They never married hastily, nor sought easy comforts. Instead, they dedicated themselves to preserving the moral and practical lessons Lenora had imparted. They taught their own children to read carefully, to question authority, and to value evidence and foresight over fear. The Whitlock lineage became synonymous not with terror or vengeance, but with vigilance, integrity, and a relentless pursuit of truth. By 1858, Cedar Glen had matured into a community marked by cautious stability. Roads and homes had improved, trade had increased, and the once pervasive fear had transformed into a quiet respect for the land and its history. Some settlers still avoided the ridge where Lenora had fought her final battle, sensing a lingering presence, a quiet judgment that reminded them of their ancestors' sin. Farmers reported hearing whispers among the cornfields at dusk, and travelers occasionally claimed glimpses of a shadowed figure on the ridge, a woman watching over the valley, protective and unwavering. The Whitlocks did not encourage these tales, but they did not deny them either. Eli and Jonas understood that Lenora's legacy was both literal and spiritual. Her courage had reshaped the community, but it had also left an indelible mark on the collective psyche of Cedar Glen, a reminder that the line between justice and vengeance was as fragile as a flickering candle. They honored her memory quietly, through deeds, education, and vigilance rather than spectacle or storytelling. In the final years of the decade, the Whitlocks faced new challenges as settlers from farther east moved into Missouri, bringing with them unfamiliar customs, competing claims to land, and renewed legal scrutiny. The brothers, drawing upon the lessons their mother had imparted, navigated these pressures with pragmatism and wisdom. Their ability to anticipate threats, negotiate disputes, and uphold the community's moral center became a stabilizing force in an era of expansion and uncertainty. Even after death, Lenora Whitlock's influence persisted. Elders of Cedar Glen spoke of her courage to the young, framing her story as a parable of vigilance and moral responsibility. Local ministers occasionally referenced her sacrifice, not in sermons of sanctity, but as a cautionary lesson that even in a pious community, unchecked ambition and secrecy could breed horrors, and that individuals, particularly women often underestimated, could wield influence far beyond what was expected. By 1860, as the nation approached the precipice of civil conflict, Cedar Glen remained a small but morally aware community. The Whitlocks' presence ensured that the darker impulses of humanity were kept in check, not by fear, but by the careful cultivation of truth and accountability. The shadow of Lenora Whitlock, the woman who had faced impossible odds, uncovered hidden crimes, and sacrificed herself for her children, remained an invisible sentinel over the valley. Her legacy was not merely in the survival of her family, but in the lessons she had etched into the moral framework of the community: courage, foresight, and the relentless pursuit of justice, even when the cost was ultimate. And so, in the rolling hills and dense forests of the Missouri Ozarks, the story of Lenora Whitlock endured, not as a tale of ghostly terror, but as a chronicle of the extraordinary power of one determined woman to challenge corruption, protect the innocent, and ensure that truth, however delayed, could triumph over secrecy and malice. Her life, her choices, and her sacrifice became woven into the very fabric of Cedar Glen, a haunting yet inspiring testament to the resilience of the human spirit. As the 1860s dawned, the Missouri Ozarks stood on the edge of transformation. National tensions mounted, and the rumble of civil conflict loomed across the frontier. Cedar Glen, once a quiet settlement shaped by fear and secrecy, had grown into a small but vigilant community, largely because of the lessons left behind by Lenora Whitlock. Her sacrifice had forged a lineage of wisdom and resilience, embodied in her sons, Eli and Jonas, who now bore the weight of guiding both family and town through uncertain times. The Whitlocks faced the approaching storm of national strife with a rare combination of pragmatism and foresight. The town had not forgotten the horrors of the past. Secret conspiracies, untimely deaths, and the meeting house fire remained vivid memories. Rumors persisted that some remnants of the founding family's dark influence lingered,
Though weak, Eli and Jonas understood that the stability of Cedar Glen required vigilance, not complacency. They organized informal councils with other respected families, fostering a community that prioritized transparency and cooperation over fear and silence. Despite the peace they had built, shadows of Lenora's past battles lingered. Some settlers claimed to see her figure on foggy mornings along the ridge, watching over the valley as if the land itself had become her eternal domain. Children whispered her name in awe and fear, while adults nodded knowingly at her legend, unsure whether to see her as ghost, guardian, or moral symbol. Eli and Jonas never discouraged these stories, recognizing that Lenora's memory served both as inspiration and deterrent, reminding everyone of the cost of corruption and the power of courage. In 1862, the Civil War reached Missouri, bringing conflict to the doorstep of Cedar Glen. Skirmishes, raids, and the threat of lawlessness tested the community's resolve. The Whitlocks played a central role in protecting their neighbor. Jonas coordinated the defense of the settlement, leveraging the knowledge of the surrounding terrain, while Eli managed communications, keeping track of troop movements and potential threats. Their mother's teachings had instilled in them the importance of preparation, observation, and intelligence skills that proved invaluable as Cedar Glen weathered the turbulence. Amidst the chaos, Eli discovered more documents that had survived the meeting house fire, hidden in unlikely places throughout the settlement. They revealed the extent to which the original conspiracies had intertwined with regional authorities and even neighboring towns. Some letters suggested that the shadow of corruption had persisted quietly, exploiting the instability of war to conceal debts, property seizures, and unpunished crimes. Eli realized that his mother's vigilance was needed now more than ever, as her foresight had equipped the family to act as guardians of justice in a time when chaos threatened to undo everything she had fought for. Meanwhile, Jonas found himself confronting the moral dilemmas Lenora had faced decades earlier. Reports of marauders and opportunistic neighbors abusing the law forced him to balance community protection with restraint. He often thought of his mother, imagining her calm yet determined presence guiding his choices. She had taught him that vengeance could never replace justice, and that courage required both restraint and decisiveness. These principles guided him as he patrolled the surrounding woods, ensured safe passage for families, and prevented escalation between rival groups. The Whitlocks' efforts began to bear fruit. Cedar Glen survived the war largely intact, earning a reputation in the region for resilience and unity. Outsiders noted the community's unusual harmony, unaware that the lessons of Lenora Whitlock's struggle against corruption had created a culture of accountability and foresight. The town's elders quietly praised the Whitlocks, recognizing the enduring influence of a mother who had, through tragedy and courage, shaped not only her children but an entire settlement. By 1865, with the war's end, the Whitlocks turned their attention to rebuilding and preserving the town's history. Eli created a careful archive of surviving documents, letters, and records, ensuring that the lessons of Cedar Glen's turbulent past would not be lost. Jonas, ever practical, repaired and reinforced homes, roads, and community buildings, emphasizing both safety and resilience. They also established a tradition of storytelling among younger generations, sharing the moral complexities of their mother's life in ways that instilled both caution and courage. Even decades after her death, Lenora Whitlock's presence shaped Cedar Glen. The ridge where the meeting house once stood became a place of reflection and quiet reverence. Families brought their children to the site, telling them about a mother who had sacrificed everything to protect her children and expose the truth. Some claimed to hear whispers in the wind, others glimpsed a shadow among the trees, but all agreed that her spirit lingered, vigilant and unyielding. In these years, the Whitlocks grew into community pillars, but their personal lives remained tempered by the weight of history. Both brothers married later than many peers, choosing partners who shared their respect for history, prudence, and the protection of truth. Eli's children inherited his meticulous nature and sense of responsibility, while Jonas's children inherited his courage and strategic mind. Together, the next generation of Whitlocks carried forward Lenora's legacy, balancing the wisdom of the past with the opportunities of a changing world. By the late 1860s, Cedar Glen had emerged as a beacon of resilience in the Missouri Ozarks. The scars of corruption and tragedy remained, but they served as reminders of what had been overcome. Lenora Whitlock's story, once whispered in fear, had transformed into a narrative of moral courage, foresight, and the enduring power of sacrifice. Her sons, their families, and the town itself ensured that her lessons were never forgotten, embedding them in both history and community culture. The haunting of Lenora Whitlock was no longer one of terror, but of vigilance, guidance, and moral clarity. Cedar Glen stood as a living testament to the enduring influence of a mother who had faced impossible odds, uncovered hidden crimes, and paid the ultimate price to protect her children. Her legacy reminded everyone that courage, integrity, and the relentless pursuit of truth could shape the destiny of a community long after one life had ended. Even as the nation healed from conflict, the Ozarks remembered her. The wind through the trees carried whispers of her name. The ridge where the old meeting house had stood became sacred ground, and in every cautious, brave, and thoughtful act by her descendants, Lenora Whitlock lived on, a shadowed guardian of justice, an eternal witness to the consequences of human greed and the power of individual courage. The Missouri Ozarks in the 1870s were a place of quiet recovery. The scars of the Civil War remained etched on the land, but Cedar Glen had endured, largely because of the foundation laid by Lenora Whitlock decades earlier. Her sons, Eli and Jonas, had become more than community leaders. They were custodians of history, protectors of truth, and the living embodiments of their mother's unyielding courage. Eli, meticulous and thoughtful, devoted himself to preserving the town's historical record. He compiled journals, letters, and surviving documents, creating a careful archive that told the story of Cedar Glen's turbulent past. These records chronicled corruption, deception, and tragedy, but also the acts of bravery and moral integrity that had ensured the town's survival. Scholars and curious travelers occasionally arrived, eager to learn the truth about the Ozarks frontier, and Eli guided them with the same steady hand his mother would have admired.
Jonas, ever vigilant and pragmatic, focused on ensuring the community's safety. He reinforced roads, maintained watchtowers along the ridges, and organized volunteer patrols that protected against both natural and human threats. His strategic mind, honed in wartime and through decades of vigilance, ensured that Cedar Glen remained a rare bastion of order in a region still recovering from chaos. Though decades had passed since Lenora's death, her presence remained palpable. Children who grew up hearing her story spoke her name with reverence, learning lessons of courage, vigilance, and moral clarity. Local legends told of the shadow of a woman watching over the ridge, especially near the ruins of the old meeting house, and townsfolk treated the site with a quiet solemnity. Some claimed that during foggy mornings, her figure could be glimpsed among the trees, as if reminding the living that vigilance was a lifelong duty. The Whitlock descendants carried forward this legacy in ways both practical and symbolic. Eli's eldest son, Thomas, inherited his father's love of records and history. He became the town's unofficial archivist, ensuring that the lessons of the past were never lost. Jonas's daughter, Miriam, displayed her father's courage and strategic insight, often taking leadership roles in community projects and local defense planning. Together, the next generation continued to embody the principles their grandmother had fought to protect: truth, integrity, and protection of the innocent. During this decade, Cedar Glen faced new challenges. Outside investors and opportunistic land speculators sought to take advantage of the Ozarks' recovering economy, attempting to acquire property through manipulation or intimidation. The Whitlocks, guided by Lenora's principles, stood firm. Using the archived documents Eli had carefully preserved, they exposed fraudulent claims and protected families who might otherwise have lost everything. Lenora's spirit of justice and vigilance was not only preserved, it actively shaped the moral landscape of the town. Beyond Cedar Glen, the story of Lenora Whitlock began to circulate more widely. Travelers from neighboring counties spoke of a mother whose courage had defied corruption, whose foresight had saved a community, and whose legacy ensured justice long after her death. Some doubted the veracity of these tales, attributing them to folklore and exaggeration, but others recognized the consistency in accounts of Cedar Glen's moral resilience. Her story became a symbol that one person's bravery could ripple across generations, shaping not only immediate circumstances but the very character of a community. By the late 1870s, as America itself transformed with railroads, new towns, and expanding trade, Cedar Glen remained a quiet haven, guided by the moral compass established by Lenora Whitlock. The Whitlocks had become both stewards of history and protectors of a community's ethical foundation. They knew that vigilance was never complete, corruption and greed could re-emerge if left unchecked, but they also knew that the lessons of the past, the sacrifices, the courage, the relentless pursuit of truth, would provide the guidance needed to confront any challenge. Even as time passed and new generations were born, the shadow of Lenora Whitlock persisted, not as a source of terror but as a guardian. Parents told their children of her courage, neighbors spoke of her wisdom, and the community recognized that the peace and stability they now enjoyed were the direct result of her sacrifice. The ridge where the meeting house had once stood became a place of quiet reflection, a site where history and legend intertwined, and where the principles she had fought for were etched into the collective memory of Cedar Glen. The story of Lenora Whitlock's courage continued to inspire resilience in every crisis. During droughts, floods, or disputes over land and resources, the Whitlocks invoked her lessons of vigilance, strategic planning, and moral fortitude. The town grew stronger with each challenge, guided by the enduring influence of a mother who had faced impossible odds and chosen truth and justice above her own life. By 1880, the Missouri Ozarks had changed. Railroads connected distant towns, commerce began to flourish, and the wilderness receded before the push of expansion. Cedar Glen, however, retained a unique character, blending frontier pragmatism with a deep-rooted respect for history and morality. Visitors remarked on the town's unusual cohesion and ethical foundation, unaware that it owed much to a long-dead woman whose courage had shaped not only her children but an entire community. The Whitlocks remained vigilant custodians of her legacy. They ensured that every act of corruption, every injustice, and every threat to the innocent was met with the principles Lenora had embodied: foresight, courage, and an unwavering commitment to truth. Even as the nation moved toward modernity, Cedar Glen retained the lessons of the past, the wisdom of sacrifice, and the memory of a mother whose actions had transcended her own life. Lenora Whitlock's story, once whispered in fear, had become a narrative of moral clarity and enduring influence. Her shadow watched over Cedar Glen, a reminder that courage, integrity, and relentless pursuit of justice could shape the destiny of an entire community. And in the hearts and actions of her descendants, she lived on, a silent guardian, a moral compass, and a testament to the power of one individual to change the course of history. The Missouri Ozarks in the 1880s were changed. Railroads had begun to thread through valleys and along ridges, connecting isolated communities like Cedar Glen to larger towns and cities. The wilderness that had once defined the region was slowly giving way to commerce, schools, and civic structure. Yet amidst this transformation, the legacy of Lenora Whitlock remained deeply woven into the fabric of the town. Eli Whitlock, now in his 50s, had become both historian and unofficial mayor, guiding Cedar Glen through a period of rapid development while ensuring that the lessons of the past were not lost. He meticulously preserved his mother's journals and the archives of early settlers, including detailed accounts of the conflicts, tragedies, and conspiracies that had once threatened the town. These records became a source of pride and a warning, demonstrating how easily greed and corruption could spread in communities left unchecked. Jonas Whitlock, though older and less physically active than in his youth, maintained oversight of the town's security and infrastructure. His keen sense of strategy, inherited from decades of defending Cedar Glen, now took the form of civic planning, reinforcing bridges, creating fire breaks, and advising on property disputes to prevent exploitation. His reputation for fairness and shrewd judgment spread beyond Cedar Glen, earning the respect of neighboring settlements. During this time, Cedar Glen saw an influx of new families, seeking opportunities in the expanding Ozarks economy. Many of these newcomers had no knowledge of the region's turbulent past. It fell to the Whitlocks to instill a sense of moral responsibility, teaching that prosperity was meaningless without integrity. Eli and Jonas held gatherings where elders shared stories of the frontier era, of deception, sacrifice, and courage. Lenora Whitlock's tale became central to these lessons, a parable of vigilance, justice, and moral fortitude. The story of Lenora's confrontation with the corrupt officials of Cedar Glen had grown into local legend. Some recounted it as a ghost story, emphasizing the eerie presence of her spirit at the site of the old meeting house. Others told it as history, focusing on her cunning, her courage, and the sacrifices she had made to protect her children and the community. Both interpretations carried weight, for in Cedar Glen the boundary between legend and history, often blurred, shaped by the truths the town's residents had witnessed or inherited. By the 1890s, the Whitlocks were actively documenting the town's expansion,
noting every land transaction, every civic decision, and every legal dispute. They ensured that Cedar Glen's development remained grounded in accountability, creating a town governance system that blended frontier pragmatism with ethical oversight. Schools emphasized not just reading and arithmetic, but also lessons in morality and community responsibility, inspired by the story of Lenora Whitlock. Despite these successes, the shadow of past conspiracies lingered. Families with hidden motives sometimes attempted to exploit Cedar Glen's growing prosperity, yet Lenora's influence persisted. Her descendants, guided by her example, approached every challenge with strategic thought, moral clarity, and the readiness to confront corruption wherever it arose. Even those who tried to manipulate or deceive found themselves exposed by careful record-keeping and the Whitlocks' vigilance. As Cedar Glen matured, so too did the influence of Lenora's story beyond the town itself. Scholars and journalists from larger cities occasionally visited, drawn by accounts of a frontier community, whose founding myths were intertwined with tales of courage, justice, and survival. Lenora Whitlock was often cited as the exemplar of frontier morality, a woman who had faced impossible odds, stood against corruption, and ensured that future generations could live under a just and accountable society. By the end of the century, Cedar Glen had become a thriving community, balanced between progress and the lessons of history. Eli's sons and Jonas's daughters continued the work their parents had begun, ensuring that every new building, road, and school reflected the ethical foundations Lenora had fought to preserve. Even as industrialization crept into the region, bringing new opportunities and new threats, the town remained vigilant, a community shaped by the courage of a single mother, whose actions had altered the course of history. Lenora Whitlock's presence, though long passed from the mortal world, remained palpable. On quiet mornings, the wind through the ridges seemed to whisper her name. On fog-laden evenings, townsfolk swore they saw a figure walking among the old meeting-house ruins, watching over Cedar Glen. Her legacy was not only in the physical town or the structured governance her children maintained, but also in the ethos of the community itself, a moral compass that refused to compromise with greed, corruption, or violence. By 1895, Cedar Glen had become a model of frontier resilience and ethical governance. The town had grown in population, infrastructure, and economy, yet it retained a unique character, one shaped by history, vigilance, and the indelible influence of a mother who had risked everything to protect her children and the community. In homes, schools, and civic meetings, the story of Lenora Whitlock continued to inspire courage and integrity, a living reminder that the actions of one person could ripple across decades and generations. The tale of Lenora Whitlock, once a whispered story of tragedy and vengeance, had evolved into a legend of moral fortitude. Her descendants ensured that her sacrifices were neither forgotten nor in vain. Cedar Glen stood as a testament to her vision, a community where courage, vigilance, and justice were not merely ideals but practiced principles, guiding the town into the modern era, while keeping alive the spirit of a mother whose determination had reshaped the course of history. The dawn of the 20th century brought profound change to Cedar Glen. Electricity crept into homes, telephones connected neighbors who had once relied on letters and word of mouth, and automobiles began to rattle along the newly graded roads that replaced horse-drawn. Yet for all this progress, the legacy of Lenora Whitlock remained an unbroken thread through the town's evolution.
Eli Whitlock, now elderly and frail, watched with quiet pride as his grandchildren took up positions in the town's civic life. He continued to maintain the family archives, meticulously organizing Lenora's journals, the original land deeds, and the correspondence that documented the town's founding and the struggles that had shaped its ethical framework. These records were not merely historical curiosities, they were guiding principles, lessons in morality, resilience, and the cost of justice. The town's youth were especially fascinated by the stories of Lenora Whitlock. School teachers wove her tale into lessons about integrity, courage, and personal responsibility. Children would whisper about seeing a shadowy figure near the ruins of the old meeting house, convinced that Lenora's spirit was still watching, ensuring that Cedar Glen remained true to the principles she had fought to preserve. Local historians documented these accounts, treating them as part of the town's rich folklore, blending history and legend into a tapestry that shaped the community's identity. Economic growth brought new families and new challenges. Some newcomers sought to exploit Cedar Glen's expansion for personal gain, testing the ethical standards that Lenora had helped establish. Yet the town's governance, guided by her descendants, remained vigilant. Disputes over land, commerce, and influence were addressed through transparency and accountability, often referencing the precedent set by Lenora's courage. Her story had become a moral anchor, a warning that corruption and greed would not go unchallenged. During this period, Cedar Glen also faced natural adversities that threatened to undo its hard-won stability. Floods swept through the valleys, fires threatened wooden structures, and harsh winters tested the community's resilience. Each time, the Whitlocks played a central role in coordinating relief efforts and rebuilding. Their actions were guided not only by practical necessity, but by the ethical compass inherited from Lenora. She had taught that survival required courage, but true community strength demanded justice and foresight. The early decades of the 20th century also saw the rise of state and federal oversight, bringing the legal structures that Lenora had once lacked. Courts, inspectors, and law enforcement officers now monitored Cedar Glen more closely, yet even under this scrutiny, the town's unique ethical culture persisted. The Whitlocks' meticulous record-keeping, begun in the aftermath of Lenora's conflicts, proved invaluable. Land disputes, inheritance claims, and civic decisions were now informed by centuries of carefully preserved history, ensuring that justice was administered fairly and that the lessons of the past were not forgotten. Lenora's influence extended beyond Cedar Glen as well. Neighboring towns took notice of the Whitlocks' methodical approach to governance, ethical oversight, and community preservation. Scholars studying the development of frontier towns frequently cited Cedar Glen as an exceptional case. A settlement shaped, not just by opportunity but by moral vigilance, where the actions of one courageous woman had rippled across generations to influence thousands of lives. Amid these societal shifts, the Whitlock children and grandchildren grew increasingly aware of the dual nature of their heritage. They inherited not only the town's prosperity and influence, but also the weight of responsibility. Every decision, from public policy to family affairs, was measured against the standards set by Lenora. Her story was a constant reminder that courage alone was insufficient. Integrity, foresight, and accountability were equally essential. Despite progress, whispers of the supernatural persisted. On foggy mornings, townsfolk would report seeing a figure moving silently near the ruins of the old meeting house, or lights flickering in the empty building late at night. Some dismissed these as tricks of the light, or the product of imagination. Yet others swore that Lenora's spirit remained, guarding Cedar Glen against complacency, corruption, and moral decay. The phenomenon reinforced the town's collective memory and commitment to ethical governance. By the 1920s, Cedar Glen had transformed into a thriving, modernized town. Schools offered comprehensive education, local businesses prospered, and civic engagement was high. Yet the lessons of the frontier era remained embedded in the town's culture. Governance structures emphasized accountability and transparency, land transactions were carefully documented, and the moral tales of Lenora Whitlock were preserved in both oral tradition and written record. Eli Whitlock, in his final years, reflected on the journey from frontier struggles to modern governance. He understood that Cedar Glen's resilience was not merely a product of geography or fortune, but of the enduring influence of Lenora Whitlock. Her courage, her moral clarity, and her unwavering commitment to justice had established a foundation that would guide the town for generations. In his mind, she was not a relic of the past but a living presence, her principles shaping every corner of Cedar Glen and every decision made within its boundaries. The story of Lenora Whitlock had grown beyond the boundaries of Cedar Glen, influencing the broader Ozarks region. Visitors, historians, and journalists documented her life as a case study in moral courage, illustrating how one individual's commitment to justice could shape an entire community. Lenora's legacy became a symbol of the frontier's complex moral landscape, demonstrating the tension between survival, ethics, and the pursuit of justice in a world often defined by hardship and opportunity alike. As the 1920s drew to a close, Cedar Glen stood as a testament to the enduring power of legacy. The town's prosperity, civic integrity, and social cohesion were rooted in the sacrifices and courage of Lenora Whitlock, whose life had been marked by both tragedy and triumph. Her descendants, guided by her example, continued to nurture the community, ensuring that Cedar Glen remained not just a place of opportunity but a beacon of moral vigilance in the Ozarks. The story of Lenora Whitlock, spanning nearly a century from frontier struggles to modern governance, remained a cornerstone of Cedar Glen's identity. It served as a constant reminder that courage, integrity, and the willingness to confront injustice could shape not only individual lives but entire community. Her spirit, whether seen as literal or symbolic, continued to guide the town, a testament to the power of one woman's determination to protect her family and uphold the principles of justice. By the mid-1920s, Cedar Glen had evolved from a frontier settlement into a town marked by modest prosperity and social progress. The automobile had replaced horse-drawn wagons, telephones connected distant neighbors, and the first radio stations brought news, music, and entertainment into homes that had once been illuminated solely by oil lamps. Yet despite these changes, the shadow of Lenora Whitlock's legacy lingered over the town like a guardian spirit. Eli Whitlock, now an octogenarian, remained the town's living repository of history. His careful preservation of Lenora's journals, deeds, and correspondence ensured that each generation of Whitlocks understood the sacrifices and moral courage that had shaped Cedar Glen. He trained his grandchildren in the importance of ethical stewardship, not merely in business or civic matters, but in daily life, teaching them that the community's prosperity was inseparable from integrity and accountability. The town's younger residents often regarded Lenora's story as legend, told in hushed tones around campfires, or in the classroom. Children were fascinated by tales of a woman who had faced impossible odds, confronted corrupt powers, and sacrificed everything to protect her family. Yet for all the mythic elements, elders emphasized that her courage was grounded in practical action, moral reasoning, and unyielding vigilance. Her ghost, real or imagined, became a moral touchstone, reminding Cedar Glen that ethical lapses could have consequences extending far beyond the immediate moment. The Great Depression tested the town's resilience in ways that Lenora herself might have recognized. Agricultural markets collapsed, banks failed, and unemployment rose sharply, yet Cedar Glen weathered the storm better than many neighboring communities. The Whitlocks and other descendants of Lenora's contemporaries organized local relief efforts, pooling resources, coordinating work programs, and providing shelter for families in need. In doing so, they enacted the principles that Lenora had instilled: courage tempered by compassion, and action guided by justice. Industrialization brought new opportunities and challenges. Small factories and sawmills opened in Cedar Glen, employing townspeople who had once relied solely on subsistence farming. While prosperity increased, so did tensions between traditional values and the pressures of modern industry. Lenora's story remained central in these debates. Community leaders often cited her example when negotiating labor disputes, property matters, or civic initiatives, framing her courage and integrity as a standard against which all decisions should be measured. Education flourished as well. Cedar Glen's schools emphasized not only literacy and numeracy, but also civic responsibility, history, and ethics. Teachers incorporated Lenora Whitlock's story into the curriculum, using her life as a case study in leadership, moral courage, and the consequences of corruption. Students studied the old meeting house, the ruins of which still bore faint scorch marks from the fire that had destroyed the documents, exposing frontier conspiracies. These relics served as physical reminders that actions taken to preserve justice often required personal sacrifice. Despite modernization, reports of unusual occurrences continued. Residents claimed to hear footsteps in the night near the ruins of the old Whitlock homestead, or see shadowy figures moving through fog-laden fields. Some dismissed these as superstition or the product of imagination, but others regarded them as signs of Lenora's continued vigilance. In townsfolk eyes, her presence was both protective and cautionary, a reminder that ethical decay could never be ignored. World events also left their mark on Cedar Glen. The outbreak of World War II drew young men and women from the town into service, and rationing and wartime labor initiatives altered daily life. Even amid global upheaval, Lenora's influence persisted. Town meetings, resource allocation, and support for returning veterans were guided by principles of fairness and accountability inherited from her legacy. Decisions were debated carefully, with an understanding that shortcuts or corruption would erode the moral foundations she had helped establish. The
The Whitlock family itself expanded. Children and grandchildren assumed roles as business owners, teachers, and local officials, yet all were keenly aware of the responsibilities imposed by their lineage. In every endeavor, they sought to honor Lenora's legacy, ensuring that Cedar Glen remained a town where opportunity and ethical conduct were intertwined. They understood that her courage had not been merely an act of heroism, but a blueprint for sustaining community integrity across generations. Cultural memory played a central role in preserving Lenora's influence. Annual commemorations, local theater performances, and historical exhibitions celebrated her life and the choices she had made to protect her family and the town. Newspapers recounted her story, blending fact and folklore, emphasizing the enduring moral lessons embedded in her action. Even as the world modernized, Cedar Glen's residents recognized that their town's character and its survival depended on remembering the sacrifices of those who had come before. By 1950, Cedar Glen had become a symbol of ethical resilience in the Ozarks. Its prosperity, social cohesion, and civic engagement reflected the enduring influence of Lenora Whitlock. The town's residents, bound by both memory and moral obligation, knew that their actions were part of a continuum stretching back to the frontier era. Lenora's courage and determination had established a foundation that transcended generations, ensuring that Cedar Glen's identity remained intact despite the social, economic, and technological changes that had reshaped the broader world. Lenora Whitlock's story, now spanning over a century, illustrated a profound truth: individual courage, guided by ethical principles, could shape entire communities and influence the lives of countless descendants. Cedar Glen was not merely a town built on geographic or economic opportunity. It was a community molded by the moral vigilance of one woman, whose legacy endured through documentation, storytelling, and the unwavering commitment of her family. As the mid-20th century unfolded, Cedar Glen's residents reflected on the lessons embedded in Lenora's life. They understood that prosperity without principle was fleeting, that courage without foresight was incomplete, and that the ethical foundations laid by one individual could echo across generations. Her spirit, whether perceived in shadows, whispered stories, or deliberate moral guidance, remained a constant presence, reminding the town that integrity, accountability, and courage were the pillars upon which a just and enduring community could be built.